In the last third of the Scarlet Letter, we see that a moral crisis has come for Arthur Dimmesdale. He meets Hester Prynne in the woods on his way back from a trip, and really there are multiple ways that we can interpret the moment that they have alone together. Notice that nature seems to be smiling on their meeting. Before, patches of sunlight had been evading Hester, and she had walked in gloom. Dimmesdale had first seen her coming out of the gloom when she approached him. Now, when she's reunited with him, it's like the natural world around them is smiling on their reunion. Like I said before, the beams of sunlight finally reach the two of them as they're sitting on this old overturned log. The solution that Hester poses to Dimmesdale's problem, that of fleeing with her into the heart of the woods, also treats of nature as if it's a refuge and a safe haven for this long-suffering character. One thing that Hawthorne is doing here, I think, is playing off of an idea from the Romantic tradition, that the laws of nature and the laws of mankind are actually opposed. Hester and Dimmesdale haven't violated any natural law through their adultery, and so the only place where they can feel truly free to be with each other is in the heart of nature, away from the strict rules of the Puritan community. By natural law, by the way, I don't really mean the idea of natural law as it was explored in Thomas Aquinas. I'm talking more about an evolutionary, completely natural worldview, the laws of nature, survival of the fittest, that sort of thing. Romantic writers across the Atlantic were critical of any institutions that had been handed down through the generations as received wisdom, things like that, and many were critical of the institution of marriage. They saw it as a man-made construct, not as something that had been ordained by God. So in the same vein as those writers, Hawthorne seems to be saying here that true happiness can be had outside of the man-made laws, such as marriage and such as restrictions or prohibitions against adultery, as long as a couple loves each other. But, importantly, that's not the only interpretation here. Hawthorne isn't strictly a romantic writer. Because remember that for the New England Puritans, and in Hawthorne's fiction, the wilderness, instead of being a refuge, it was a place where people went to meet the devil. In Young Goodman Brown, remember that the devil holds a black Sabbath in the woods late at night. And there are some hints dropped in these chapters of the Scarlet Letter that this meeting between Dimmesdale and Hester in the woods is another sort of diabolical meeting that's taking place, not for the good or the betterment of the characters. When Dimmesdale comes back into the town, he encounters Mistress Hibbins, the notorious town witch, and she actually makes this explicit. She accosts him in the street, and she says, "So, Reverend Sir, you have made a visit into the forest," observed the witch lady, nodding her high headdress at him. "The next time I pray you to allow me only a fair warning, and I shall be proud to bear you company. Without taking over much upon myself, my good ward will go far towards gaining any strange gentleman a fair reception from yonder potentate you wot of." And Dimmesdale understandably is confused here. He's saying, what are you talking about, a yonder potentate or ruler in the woods? I didn't go to the woods to meet any ruler there. I was there on business. And Mistress Hibbins laughs, and she says, "Well, well, we must needs talk thus in the daytime. You carry it off like an old hand, but at midnight and in the forest we shall have other talk together." So she just straight comes out and says, you were out in the woods doing the devil's business. A little earlier on in the story, actually, when Dimmesdale is approaching Hester and Pearl, Pearl mistakes him for the black man or for the devil himself when she sees him coming near from a distance. So there's plenty of indications that this forest meeting that the two of them have is bad or dangerous in some way. Dimmesdale returns from it feeling like a changed man, but not in a good way. He has all of these wild impulses to do and say wicked things, almost as if he's been possessed by some sort of an evil spirit. And why? What changed? Because during that forest meeting, he's consented to do something in cold blood that he's never consented to do before, to doing what he sees as a sin. Before, he certainly sinned with Hester, but that was an act of passion, and it says in the novel that it wasn't something that he really sat down and thought through. He just did. This is cold-blooded. This is him doing something that he knows he shouldn't do. Hester persuades him to run away from Boston with her and with Pearl, across the sea, back to Europe. And her reasons are completely understandable. Chillingworth will never let Dimmesdale have a moment's rest, and if he's allowed to continue his torments, Dimmesdale will probably die soon. Remember that Hester could have left Boston any time she wanted, but chose to remain and to face her infamy head-on. But that was for herself. Now she's thinking about the man that she loves, and she sees fleeing as the only way out for him. The novel tells us that years of living in isolation from the community and of living outside of the law have prepared Hester for this moment. They've made her less concerned about transgressing rules and worrying about sin. So for her, it's no big deal to flee. Now, we might think of this as really kind of a negative consequence that the Scarlet Letter has had on her. We've talked about the positive ones before, how it's made her more humble, it's made her valued by the community, it's made her be a good mother to Hester. But the Scarlet Letter, with a combination of the social ostracism she's faced, have made it so that the stakes are relatively low, that if she does something wrong, she's not going to really face any consequences for it. But for Dimmesdale, it is a big deal. To abandon his flock, to assume a new life, and to continue to live a lie with Hester and with Pearl, it's a huge temptation for him. And he momentarily gives in to it. As I said before, the moment of crisis has come. Is he going to choose the easy way out, or finally confess his sins, which he should have done years ago? Well, all of this comes to a head a few days later, when Dimmesdale is set to give an election day sermon. And the whole town is turned out for this event. It's a big deal, and so every character who has been in any way connected to the action of the plot is all gathered together. And Dimmesdale gives the best sermon of his life. It apparently keeps everyone in raptures. He departs from the church with what seems like a halo about his head, in all the glory of his profession, while the other town officials and clergymen begin a parade to continue on with the election proceedings. Election day is a big deal in Puritan Boston. But then they come to the scaffold, at the same scaffold that we saw at the very beginning of the story, in the middle of the story, in chapter 12, and now at the end. So that's kind of interesting that the scaffold features 3 different times at these 3 pivotal moments of the book. Dimmesdale calls Hester and Pearl to his side, mounts the wooden steps, and finally confesses before everyone that he's the father of Pearl. Now, several things happen at once here. We see that Roger Chillingworth tries to stop Dimmesdale from confessing. Remember that he's devoted his whole life to the minister's torment. If he confesses, there's nothing left to torment him with. So Chillingworth says that he would have been able to pursue him all through the world wherever he went, except for on that very scaffold. So ironically, Dimmesdale, by finally doing what he should have done, does the one thing that allows him to escape from Chillingworth's clutches once and for all. We also see that the scene touches Pearl. Dimmesdale asks her to kiss him, and the narrator tells us that when she does, it's like a spell has broken. What does he mean by that? Well, remember that a few chapters back, we read about how Pearl was someone who was outside of both man's laws and man's sympathies. Hester even confesses that emotions confuse and upset her. If somebody's too emotional or crying, it's just going to make Pearl mad. And this is because she spent her whole life basically ostracized and isolated from human contact. All she's ever had is her mother. She wouldn't be able to mourn for somebody who was ill or who was dying because she's never cared for anyone that way. And that's partly, I think, what has contributed to her seeming non-human, more like an elf or a spirit. To be a human is to have sympathy for others, to have relations and relationships with other people of the human race. But now, with the public acknowledgement of Dimmesdale, that missing link that hasn't had for her whole life, it's finally been provided. She gains a father just as she's losing him. She learns about human sympathy and human pain. And finally, we see that Dimmesdale tears open his shirt and he bares his breast before the crowd, and that a scarlet letter has been branded over his heart. Remember that for years and years he's been holding his hand over his heart when he speaks, and everybody thinks that it's this nervous habit. Well, now we see what he was clutching his chest for. There's a branded scarlet letter right there above his heart. And, it's trademark Hawthorne, from what we've read of him so far, that he gives us multiple explanations for how this brand got to be there. At the beginning of the concluding chapter, we read, "As regarded its origin, the brand's, there were various explanations, all of which must necessarily have been conjectural. Some affirmed that the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale, on the very day when Hester Prynne first wore her ignominious badge, had begun a course of penance, which he afterwards, in so many futile methods, followed out, by inflicting a hideous torture on himself. Others contended that the stigma had not been produced until a long time subsequent, when old Roger Chillingworth, being a potent necromancer, had caused it to appear through the agency of magic and poisonous drugs. Others, again, and those best able to appreciate the minister's peculiar sensibility and the wonderful operation of his spirit upon the body, whispered their belief that the awful symbol was the effect of the ever-active tooth of remorse, gnawing from the inmost heart outwardly, and at last manifesting heaven's dreadful judgment by the visible presence of the letter. The reader may choose among these theories. We have thrown all the light we could acquire upon the portent, and would gladly, now that it has done its office, erase its deep print out of our own brain." That last theory is really interesting, because we've discussed before how, in the Scarlet Letter, internal conflicts tend to manifest themselves externally. So it's not too far-fetched to believe that Dimmesdale was so guilt-stricken, so distraught, that the guilt in his mind manifested itself in his flesh all on its own. It wasn't that Dimmesdale was branding himself, it just came out as a natural consequence of the spiritual state that he was in. But this is crossing over into, I would say, supernatural territory. So Hawthorne provides rational explanations as well, just as he did in Young Goodman Brown, and just as Washington Irving did in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, you'll remember. And it's up for the readers to decide which explanation to accept. So, Dimmesdale dies. He had probably been dying for some time under the torment and the strain of guilt, but he dies with a clean conscience, finally reconciled to God and having done the right thing. He tells Hester as he's dying that he thinks that it's better this way. And we learn that not long later, Chillingworth dies as well. His only purpose in life was to torment Dimmesdale. His hate was what was keeping him alive. But without his victim, his life loses all meaning, and he soon passes away too, leaving a considerable fortune to Pearl. And the narrator kind of skims over this, but I think it's worth pondering. Why would Chillingworth leave his fortune to a child who wasn't his own? Why not leave it to a friend or to Hester? Now, we know that this is Chillingworth that we're talking about, so I hesitate to say this, but it seems like a selfless, noble act. And maybe it's a sign that Chillingworth may have had his own moment of redemption right before he died, but the narrator doesn't say. We learned that Pearl married well, most likely to a nobleman. And then, finally, at the very end of the novel, we learned that Hester returned to Boston and lived out the rest of her days in the same old isolated cabin that Pearl had grown up in. Why would Hester return to the one town where she had to bear the Scarlet Letter when she has the whole world in which to roam? I think that's another mystery, and it's one that I'll probably leave you with as we finish this series of lectures on the novel. Why do you think Hester returned? What does that tell us about her thoughts on the punishment that was imposed on her, or about her thoughts on her own spiritual condition in general, or was it for some other reason? So think about that as we continue forward here. And thanks for watching.